Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 4 as we look at the third portion of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation, and left off here with Luther's response. And just to make a quick correction, I mentioned previously that when Luther posted the 95 Thesis, he did so during, I believe I said All Souls. It was actually All Saints Day. So as Christians were going to the All Saints Day Mass, All Souls is the following day. But anyway, to add something with that, historians have wondered if, Luther, if he would have produced these theses earlier in the year, perhaps the church might have been much quicker to respond. Because in March of that year, 1517, the Catholic Church was finishing up with Lateran V, its 18th Ecumenical Council, and it's possible that if Luther would have written the 95 Thesis earlier that year, when the bishops were still in session, they would have taken up, what Luther wrote and said, "Hey, this priest monk is making some interesting points. Perhaps we should address this." But that's not what happened. And in fact, when the church finally did respond to Luther, or really Protestantism as a whole, because now you had other individuals. It wasn't until the year before Luther's death, which Luther passes away in 1546. This was 1545 when they finally did. And Luther, like I said, he was still alive when the church conveyed an ecumenical council, in this case Trent, to respond. But Luther viewed that as too little, too late. Regardless, when the Pope at the time, Leo X, heard about Luther's protest, he didn't pay much attention. He thought it was just a squabble among the various religious orders, within the Catholic Church. In this case, it was the Augustinians versus the Dominicans. It's kind of like, you could say, the various branches of the United States military. They're all on the same side. They're all to protect the United States, the U.S. Constitution, and whatnot, but they don't necessarily always get along with each other. The Army and the Marines don't always get along with each other, the Navy, the Air Force, etc. It's kind of the same thing here. Well, then by the end of the year, Leo X, he had become more concerned about Luther. This would have been probably around the time, Christmas would be celebrated, so the end of Advent. And it's said that, Leo X made the statement about how it was a drunk German that wrote these theses, and that when he sobers up, he'll change his mind. That Luther was essentially the drunk monk. Now we move to where Luther has his official break with Catholicism. Luther, he doesn't officially break with the Catholic Church until 1520, when he wrote The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. So, what exactly was happening here? Well, previously, Luther was going after things like, the disciplinarian issues within the church. You know, questions, perhaps, disciplinarian questions are things like, should members of the clergy be allowed to be married, or, do they need to be celibate? That kind of thing. That's not a doctrinal issue, that's a disciplinarian issue. But now he's going after, the official doctrines, the teachings of the church. Some of the things that he mentioned in the Babylonian captivity is how, traditionally there's understood to be seven sacraments, but Luther argued actually there's really only three: baptism, the Eucharist, and reconciliation. And then in the end, he argued, well, actually, there are really only two: baptism and the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. And on the subject of the Eucharist, he also mentioned how For the first 1,200 years of the church's history, you just had to believe that Christ was really present in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. But there wasn't an official understanding of how he was. That didn't happen until Lateran IV in 1215, where the church ruled transubstantiation to be the official understanding of how Christ is present in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. Well, from Luther's point of view, if you want to hold to transubstantiation, that's fine, that's acceptable. But if you want to have a different understanding of how Christ is present in the Eucharist, such of such as what would be called, consubstantiation, which is the view that Christ is present with the substance of bread and wine, that the substance of bread and wine is still there, and Christ is present with it together, what's called, the with, which is different from the transubstantiation, which teaches that when the celebrant recites the words of Christ from the Last Supper, this is my body, this is my blood, that Jesus becomes truly present, um, body and blood, soul and divinity under the looks and taste of bread and wine, that essentially the substance has changed, but the looks and taste will remain. So there's a different understanding between the two there. But from Luther's perspective, either one is fine. It's just fundamental that you believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. Well, in response to this, the Catholic Church excommunicated Luther. Essentially declared that Luther was no longer part of the church, kicked him out. And Luther responded to this by burning his excommunication papers and a code of canon law. Well, then the following year, 1521, Luther he summoned before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at what is known as the Diet of Worms. Diet is a gathering, Worms is a city in Germany, oldest city, I believe, in Germany. And originally, um, Luther was asked to come to Rome and explain his views, but Luther said, no, no, I know what happened to Jan Hus, and that's not going to happen to me. This would have been a little over 100 years ago from this time period. But Jan Hus was a priest from Prague, a presbyter slash priest from Prague, and he was making some controversial statements. He was questioning the doctrine of transubstantiation. He also stated how, the lay people, the laity, should be allowed to receive both the bread and the cup, whereas at this time they were only allowed to receive just the bread, and the celebrant was allowed to, drink from the cup, drink from the chalice. And one of the reasons for that was the fear of the laity potentially spilling the consecrated wine, the blood of Christ. Um, and of course, the church teaches that, if you receive Jesus under one form, you received him under both. So even if you receive just the bread, the body, you would also receive the blood too. But anyway, there was an ecumenical council taking place at this time called the Council of Constance. And so, Huss was invited to come and explain his views. He goes and he never comes back. They burned him at the stake. So Luther's like, no, I'm not going to Rome. That's not going to happen. So they eventually, both sides come to terms with Worms, a city in Germany. So Luther arrives. His opponent is Cardinal Cajetan, and Kajantian had a lot of centuries of theology, really against Luther. He's got, of course, the Bible, the church fathers, the ecumenical councils, and Luther essentially, responds back to this by stating how he finds, the fathers of the church and the ecumenical councils to be, contradictory. So he's going to focus solely with the Bible. Now, I think of course, what about this passage versus this passage in the Bible? But Luther, when you understand perhaps his mentality, you could, disregard that for a moment. But in any case, Luther, he loses and he makes this statement that if you are, a Lutheran, you might perhaps have seen, images of Luther like standing in defiance, you know, against his opponents there at the Diet of Worms, where he makes this traditional response. My conscience is captive to the word of God, which that would be the Bible. To go against conscience is neither right nor safe. I therefore cannot and will not recant. Here I stand, I can do no other. That's traditionally the response that Luther gives. However, when historians went back and examined the evidence, they thought that perhaps, this might have been a little bit of Lutheran piety, that what actually happened was that Luther sat in his chair behind the table he was given and essentially said, well, if you're going to kill me, you better hurry it up and get it over with because I'm not changing my points of view. But Luther was not killed, though he was declared to be outside the law, which essentially what that means is that if somebody wanted to, assassinate, knock off, kill Luther, they would receive no type of punishment. But Luther wasn't killed. He had a protector in Frederick the Wise, the Elector, the Prince of Saxony. So he protects Luther, and he in fact gave Luther the monastery that he resided in, the Augustinian monastery, and that became Luther's house. And that's where Luther students would often spend time, at the various, now former monastic cells, learning. That would be their quarters where they would stay. And that's also where Luther produced his translation of the Bible, the Luther Bible, the Luther Bible. Well, I believe that we'll stop here. So in the next lecture, we will finish up with Luther and then move into John Calvin, the other person that we need to look at here. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.